Welcome to the Bronx African American History Project. My name is Stephen Payne, Director of the Bronx County Historical Society. Today is Wednesday, June 28th, 2023, and I'm really happy to be here with Norris Burroughs, whose family has an extremely interesting history. He spent at least part of his life in the Allerton Coops, or the United Workers Cooperative Colony, known by a few names, on 2700 Bronx Park East. And Norris today will be talking about his family history and background and some of his early experiences growing up in the Coops. Norris, thank you very much for agreeing to be a part of this.
So you're most welcome. Can I there's a big white box in front of us at the moment.
Okay.
I just hit got it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it says the options are leave meeting or got it. So let me just, yeah, there we go. Okay. Perfect.
Okay. So let's start with the first question. We almost always start these oral histories off by asking people to talk a little bit about their family history and background and how they ended up in the Bronx. In your case, let's go even more specifically how your family ended up in the Coops, whatever you might know about that history.
Well, my mother is basically Scottish, Irish, English. Her family pretty much comes from the UK, but we've been in this country, or her side of the family's been in this country since the mid 1700s. My great grandfather was John Broome, who was a Revolutionary War hero, served with George Washington, and was the governor, the lieutenant governor of New York. And basically his children and grandchildren became artists and architects and did pretty well. On my father's side, my family is pretty much mixed blood, Black, Native American, white. My great grandfather was a Reconstruction politician. His illegitimate son is my grandfather, but he was named Norris Cooney, and there's a Wikipedia page on him, as well as John Broome, the gentleman I mentioned on my mother's side. My grandfather was a postal worker, but he was also a Shakespearean reader, and he was a very close friend of W.E.B. Du Bois. They were students together at Wilberforce, and he married a woman named Sarah Jones, who Williana Jones, who was who also has a Wikipedia page. She was a fairly prominent communist. She was a teacher in the 1920s, and she was invited to the Soviet Union during Stalin's reign to serve as an example of how the Soviet Union would treat the downtrodden people of America. So while he was murdering millions of his own people, he basically used my grandparents to sort of show, how evil and decadent America was towards, various types of people. So she brought two of her sons to the Soviet Union to be educated. My father decided to go to Berlin to study acting. He studied with Erwin Piscator in the 1920s. He was in a play called Good Soldier Schweik. He also has a Wikipedia page, which I was able to set up. And when he returned to America in the mid-1930s, he appeared in Orson Welles' all-Black production of Macbeth, was referred to as Voodoo Macbeth, which is a big hit. It played in Harlem, and basically was very successful. They did a summer stock, and that's where my mother and father met first. But they were kept in touch by letters, but then they both got married to separate people and lost touch with each other. And they reunited in about 1949 and got married, and then had two children. My sister was born in 1950 and I was born in 1952. We lived in Spanish Harlem. Anyway, I'll break here in case you want me to expand on any of that stuff. Any
Sure.
questions about anything I've said?
Sure,
You know,
yeah. So first of all, just for the record, even though I know the answer to this question and you obviously do, but what was the name of your sister?
Corolla Burroughs.
Williana Burroughs. Yeah.
She passed away several years ago, unfortunately, prematurely.
Hmm. Wow. And as far as your father goes, did he ever share much with you about his time in the Soviet Union and Germany? Did he share many memories with you
He
about his
didn't.
time?
He didn't spend much time in Russia. He decided he wanted to go to Germany to study acting pretty quickly. I think he worked as a welder for a while. I have a lot of details on paper, but I'm a little hazy on exactly what he did in Russia.
Sure.
But he wasn't there for very long. His two brothers essentially became Russians. His younger brother forgot how to speak English, and they
Oh,
both returned to America. Uh, they were drafted by selective service, so all of them, all three brothers served in the Army. My dad was in the Army Air Corps, and yeah, I don't know how I got on this topic, but yeah, Russia. I don't have many clear recollections or of stories about Russia. More familiar with what he did in Germany.
sure, sure. And did had Williana already passed? I guess she'd probably long been passed by the time you were born. Is that right?
Yeah, she died in the 1940s, I think. I have a lot of clippings. I'd have to look specifically at the date,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
she also has a Wikipedia page. As a matter of fact, that started the whole Wikipedia thing because the person that contacted me was interested in communists and socialists specifically, and
Nice.
contacted me asking details on, was putting together a page and was asking me specifics, but I never knew her.
Did you know any of your other grandparents, or were they all passed by the time you were born?
Uh, my maternal grandmother's, my mother's mother, I I spoke to on the phone, but she was living in Florida. She remarried, retired to Florida after her husband, my grandfather died. Yeah, she was the only grandparent I had any contact with, unfortunately.
I see. And when you all were growing up, did you have any family members, extended family members in the New York area on either side of the family?
Well, when I was born, the whole family was living together for a while in a single railroad apartment. My uncle Neil and his son Timothy, who changed his name to Talib, was born there, and there was my aunt Allison's, called herself Allison. Her son Charles Joseph, I think was either born in that apartment or moved there. And I don't remember if my uncle Charles was living there at the time, but I saw them. I remember them very vaguely growing up, but then they all moved away, and we were alone in that apartment, and that was on 123rd Street in East Harlem,
Hmm.
and lived there until I was, yeah, I think I was 5 going on 6 when we moved to the Bronx, to the Coops.
And do you have many memories of the apartment in East Harlem?
Yeah, I remember the layout of the apartment. I remember a couple of things about the neighborhood, walking around the neighborhood. Mount
Yeah.
Morris Park, going for walks in Mount Morris Park, which is nearby. I remember the elevated New York Central Railroad train went by, and there was a Spanish market there that served lots of fruits and vegetables and various comestibles. The neighborhood was heavily Latin American. I'd say it was at least as much Latin American as it was African American.
Sure.
So I took Spanish in high school, and I wasn't a particularly good student, but I had a pretty decent accent because I'd heard the language a lot growing up.
Sure. Sure. And what was it like moving to the Bronx as a 6-year-old? What are some of your earliest memories of the Bronx and the Coop specifically?
Well, compared to Harlem, it was wonderful because we had Bronx Park on one side. We had a great playground on the other side. And the Coops themselves were just a delight. We would run around the gardens and play games with the other kids, round up tag, and we'd play ball in the playground. It was pretty idyllic. I don't have too many negative memories growing up. I could think about a couple of incidences when I became aware of the whole racial issue, but it was never particularly stressful or traumatic. It may have been because, I look white. I was perceived as white, and anyone I came in contact with, if they found out my background, it wasn't much of an issue. It was funny though. One of my first negative experiences associated with race, I was probably around 7 or 8 years old. I was in the playground by myself playing with my rubber ball, and this black kid came up to me. He was probably the same age as me, and just started kind of bugging me. And I was like, what's this kid's problem? He wasn't, hitting me, and he was just kind of like annoying me. And then at some point, he said, I bet you're going to call me a nigger now. Yeah. And I was like, what the fuck are you talking? And I said, no, my dad's brown skin. The word black wasn't used then. It was either Negro, or my parents would refer to someone as being brown skin, like she's a brown skin gal. So I said, my dad's brown. He's, Yeah. So then kid was cool. After that, he left me alone. Wow. But it was compared to Harlem, it felt like a really nice place to be for the most part. I would say until later, when school busing happened. And, I don't know if you're familiar with the Cross Bronx Expressway, but they basically cut the Bronx in half at around 180th Street. And that side, basically the south side of that area became a ghetto pretty much gradually. And our area was kind of cut off from all of that. But around 1965 or 66, they started busing kids from the South Bronx into my junior high school, 135. And I think because of the fact that these kids weren't from the neighborhood, and they were just suddenly, because there was a fairly decent mix of Black, Hispanic, even Asian kids in the school that were from the neighborhood. There was a project a little further north from us that was pretty mixed, Black and Hispanic and white. So a lot of these kids we grew up with, but then all of a sudden these other kids from the South Bronx came into the mix, and there was much more tension and resentment between those kids and the ones that were basically native to the area.
Sure. You mentioned your junior high, just rewinding a bit, and then we'll get more into some of what you were just speaking about. But
yeah, sure.
Which elementary school did you go to?
PS 96.
PS 96. I figured. And I guess living in Harlem, you probably started elementary school down there. Is that right?
Yeah, I had kindergarten. Pretty sure I was in kindergarten in elementary school. I mean, in Harlem, but I remember the second grade, but I don't really, and I have photographs from the second grade on up, but I'm not really sure where I went to kindergarten.
Sure. Do you have many memories from PS 96?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Um, what what kinds of teachers did you have? Did any of them stand out, or did any of them make a particular impression on you?
Um, I'd have to say not until like the fifth and sixth grade. I had a teacher named I can't even remember his name now. Yeah,
I can't remember any of my elementary school
yeah.
teachers.
There was my fifth grade teacher was particularly weird. He was his name was Mr. Forshner.
Hmm.
He kind of he was just a not a nice person. That was probably the only teacher I can remember who I didn't like.
Ah, I see, I
Actually
see.
didn't like because he was kind of sadistic and he was sort of like military, kind of had a old school rap him on the knuckles. I mean, he didn't. I think there was only one occasion when he did anything physical, but he was just very, hard line, unpleasant. Oh, Mr. Sperber was, I think my sixth grade teacher who I really liked.
Ah,
He was a really good looking guy. Um, my mother used to call him Mr. Blueface because he had a very heavy beard. He no matter how much he shaved, his face was blue. But he was a kind of a Cary Grantish looking, kind of guy. And he was very nice. Told me I looked like Marlon Brando in my fifth grade photograph. And I didn't even know who Marlon Brando was at the time, of course,
sure,
but
sure. That's funny. Were there many other kids from the Coops at PS 96 when you went there?
oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Most of my friends went to that school.
yeah.
Most of my friends were either from the Coops or from the projects.
It's Parkside projects, right?
Parkside, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And we went to Parkside Day Camp, which was pretty cool.
Oh, I haven't heard people talk about that before. Say a little bit about that.
It was just a summer day camp, instead of it wasn't a sleepaway camp. You went
Yeah.
there from the morning, and our group was called the Pioneers. And we had T-shirts that said Parkside Day Camp Pioneers, and we'd go, we'd play ball or go on field trips. We went to like Palisades Amusement Park and places like that.
I see, I see. And as you were going through the public school system, PS 96, junior high school 135, and on to high school, which we'll get to in a little bit, but uh, did you ever feel different because you were from the Coops or for any other reason? Was there any kind of uh, you know, alienation that took place because you're from the Coops? Sometimes people will talk about that.
No, no. Oh, actually, a funny story because I had a friend from the projects. Most of my friends were Jewish. All some of my friends were black. I had one Puerto Rican friend. I had a Chinese friend, but my Jewish friend, my parents decided, this is an interesting story. My parents decided they wanted me to be socially acclimated. I'll just stop talking for a minute while this phone goes off.
Sure.
No one's answering. My wife is downstairs, but she doesn't seem to want to answer the phone. That's okay. All right, here we go. They wanted me to be socially acclimated to the area, so they sent me to a Yiddish show,
Huh.
which was run by some people in the Coops, and basically it was Bible stories, teaching the kids Yiddish, and that was a bit strange because I wasn't Jewish,
Yeah.
and I didn't particularly want to be there. But I got to learn some Yiddish. I got to learn some songs. But my friend Steve's mom told him that it was like a communist recruiting school. Because a lot of people in the neighborhood had this association with the Coops being red.
Yeah, sure.
And I guess that was just after the McCarthy thing had blown over and people were pretty paranoid It had nothing to do with politics.
Yeah.
I only became aware of the whole political thing. I know you spoke to Judy Winston, who was my sister's best friend, and who I got along with pretty well as well. And I know her dad was imprisoned for being a communist, and he went blind in jail. I don't have the specifics, but I'm sure you know the story because you've interviewed her.
Yeah, that's right.
And you interviewed Walter also as well, yes?
No,
No.
I haven't interviewed Walter yet.
Oh,
No.
okay.
Yeah.
Walter was Polish. His real name was Włodzimierz. I'm probably the only person in the neighborhood that could pronounce his name. But anyway, she was really attractive, light brown skin gal, and she was really sweet and hip. I thought she was like the hippest person that I knew at the time. But anyway, I was aware of the fact that, she said she would say like the phone would ring and she'd pick up the phone and like there was no one there. They felt their phone was being tapped or something like that because of her father. But I never met her father, as I recall. Her mother was Jewish. Yeah, most of my friends were Jews essentially.
Sure.
But I honestly did not see race the same back then, the same way that a lot of people do, because I grew up around mostly Black and Hispanic people when I was a kid.
Yeah.
I think my mother was probably the only one I knew who was, was not of color. But I had friends of all walks. And I would have to say that it wasn't until junior high school, middle of junior high school, that I started to see the tension, and it became, for about a year, it was an issue with me because I was aware that there was I think a lot of it had to do again with this element coming into the neighborhood that was alien. And the gangs were starting to form. I was in a street gang
I was
for
going to
a
ask
little
you,
while till I went to high school.
which street gang?
It was called the Young Assassins.
Oh, the Young Assassins.
There was a lot of gangs. There was a gang called the Executioners.
Yep.
If there was a gang called the Ducky Boys. If you're familiar with
Oh,
Richard
yeah.
Price, who wrote a book called The Wanderers.
That's right. Yeah, our
he
research library is in Ducky Boy Territory, former
yeah,
Ducky.
yeah. So there was a gang called the Fordham Baldies up on Fordham Road who all got drunk one night and went into the Navy, the Army recruiting station and all volunteered. And the gang just disappeared overnight. That story's in Richard Price's The Wanderers. So yeah, I was in this gang and it was like, one day it was like, hey man, we saw the niggers in the park and they're coming. They said they're going to bring their whole tribe. And I was like, what the fuck? I don't want to get involved in this. This is crazy. This is totally crazy. But then when I graduated and I went to High School of Music and Art, which was up in around Columbia University, which is essentially West Harlem. Sure. Again, it was a different atmosphere. So that whole sense of tension and reluctance to belong to associate myself with any particular people kind of disappeared pretty quickly. So I think I went through about a year, and a lot of it had to do with when I was dating, because I'd say at that time all the girls I was going out with were white, and I was like, well, what do I tell them? Do I say, my dad, so and so? But once I hit high school, it just didn't seem to be an issue anymore.
Okay.
So, I know that all of this stuff is out there. And I think now in particular, for some reason, in the last maybe 5 years, the media seems to be stressing this whole, white privilege, institutional racism, blah, 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 coming, no matter what you can do, if you're white, you're still a racist because you're white, you can't help it, all of that stuff was like, I just look, I'm just like, is this the Jim Crow South still? I mean, what's going on here? I'm kind of like Denzel Washington. It's like this guy's interviewing him, and he's saying, did you have a hard time? Blah, 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 blah. And Denzel says, listen, we're in the Four Seasons right now. What's the story? This is not 1960, it's not 1935, it's not 1965. And anyone can pretty much be who they are as far as I can see. So, I just kind of reject. I mean, I know there's racism and I know these things exist, but I just, I think when you contacted me with this whole multiracial thing, I was a bit leery because I don't want to like position myself as a victim.
Sure, sure.
I'm anything but a victim as far as I can tell. And most of my friends growing up, I'm sure they had issues, but most of my friends turned out pretty healthy. Maybe it's New York because New York was a fairly diverse person. But yeah, I don't want to start babbling too much about all of this stuff.
Yeah.
But
Why?
do you understand my position?
Absolutely. And I think the Coops is a particularly interesting kind of history within this whole nexus, because what you expressed about, your difficulty in navigating the racial consciousness, racial tension that was arising in the 60s, coming from the Coops, that's something that has been echoed by multiple other people, is, not really understanding what was going on because you're coming from a context in which those categories didn't really make sense. You didn't really experience them in the same way as others might have. So, the complexity of your experience is really the thing that seems to be shared, at least, to a significant degree, with other Koopniks whose family of mixed race background as well. I remember Peter Bryson. I don't know if you knew him or not, but he was a little younger than you. But he spoke in his oral history about like just having no idea when the Black Power movement hit, how to relate to it. Even though his dad was Black, his mom was Eastern European Jewish. But yeah, similar kind of complex navigation of that on his and others as well. So yeah, really just affirming what you shared there. Now, when it comes to you mentioned the Young Assassins, some of the other gangs. When the busing started in your junior high school, do you remember some of the gangs that came to junior high school, maybe that, from other neighborhoods or things like that? Was there conflict, kind of inter-gang conflict that was happening at the junior high school?
Well, here's an interesting story. I didn't see too much gang violence. Most of the tension I saw was basically in the school itself, in the halls of the school, just bad vibes, an occasional. I didn't even see that many fights. But one of the interesting things about my experience with the Young Assassins, and I would have to say this about humans in general. When I first joined the Young Assassins, everyone in the gang was Italian, Irish, or Jewish. Most of them were Italian and Irish. And it was like, they talk about the niggers or whatever, the so-and-so. But then 2 brothers joined the gang. They were Puerto Rican. One was dark-haired, curly hair. One was blonde, curly hair. Both good-looking kids, not particularly bright, but, charismatic. Then the last kid that joined the gang was brown. And my experience that was like, if you see someone as an abstraction, they're over there, they're the enemy. You don't know who they are, where they came from. You can call them by that epithet. But if someone comes into your circle and you relate to them as a human being, they just become your friend. So at that point, they might have used those words, but people were relating in that gang as human beings, basically. So that was always interesting to me, that as soon as someone is the enemy because they're different, but as soon as you find common ground with that person, the whole dynamic shifts, and they're just another person. So you don't look at them in the same way that you look at the guy on the other side of the block.
Definitely. Yeah. And, I've heard the same thing about the Ford and Baldies before. Is, even though to outside gangs, they had a reputation as being, more or less an all white gang. There were plenty of gray areas, even with the Ford and Baldies, this notorious gang. But yeah. And same thing a couple decades later on, there's a graffiti crew called the Morris Park crew that, operated along the 2 train right there, kind of a little south. Yeah. And they were supposedly an all white gang that happened to have, probably about a dozen Puerto Rican members as well. So it's very interesting phenomenon to trace that out.
Yeah, especially when hip hop music started to grow. It's like all of a sudden you have all these white kids who, want to be black or Hispanic or whatever. They relate to the hip hop thing.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So before we continue on with high school, just a couple other childhood memories. What kinds of foods do you remember eating growing up?
A lot of Hebrew National kosher hot dogs.
Oh yeah.
Pizza, the local pizzeria, a lot of bakery food. There was a Saperstein's Bakery on Allerton Avenue.
Sure.
Egg creams, comic books and egg creams. I became a Marvel zombie as a kid, buying my comic books from Zimmerman's Candy Store and the newsstands underneath the L.
Sure.
Knishes, potato kasha knishes, pastrami sandwiches, corned beef sandwiches. Yeah, just basically deli food, lunch and counter food. White Castle hamburgers.
Oh, White Castle for sure.
Yeah,
for sure.
yeah.
It's still there now. Same White Castle, but most of the other stores that you grew up with have become, other stores now. But
can you give me like a minute and a half to check on something?
yeah, sure. I'm just
All
gonna
right.
pause it. What about either of your parents? Did either of your parents do much cooking in the house?
Well, my father was an actor, but he pretty much stopped getting jobs because he was a radio actor, and when television came along, he couldn't get as much work, or probably almost no work, because we still had, Sidney Poitier and people like that he was a pretty good friend of Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis.
Oh, okay.
And I think he probably could have gotten a lot more work, but he started to develop like stage fright, and he started to develop these different phobias. And he just didn't, I don't know, I'm not quite sure what the issue was, but he stopped looking for work as an actor. I think if someone had called him and offered him something, he would have gone for it, but I don't know if he had the wherewithal at that point. So he wasn't working very much. So he would actually do most of the cooking. And my mother was working as a clerical job in Manhattan. And yeah, he was really good with roasts and simple food like spaghetti and meatballs and
Yeah.
So he did a lot of cooking around the house, and we had pretty good simple good food, meat and vegetables and potatoes and stuff like that.
Sure. Sure. Um, and what about like music in your household? Was there much music that you would hear on a regular basis? Did your parents listen to the radio or later records?
My dad listened to a lot of news stations, but he liked pop music. He liked Sinatra a lot, and he played the radio, so I heard a lot of the you know, pop music that was pretty much based on the Great American Songbook. I know a lot. I have a photographic memory as far as a lot of those songs are concerned, so I know a lot of the lyrics of those songs. And then, of course, when the transistor radio came along, we started hearing rock and roll like doo-wop, and then, of course, the Beatles. First, the Four Seasons, I think, was the first 45 record I bought. It was Ragdoll, I think. And I bought like the Monster Mash.
Sure.
And then Beatles came along and they were huge. So everyone became a Beatle maniac. And all the British invasion bands.
Sure.
And then we'd go to the movies, and I think I saw Elvis for the first time in a movie called Kid Galahad. I didn't really know who Elvis was. We saw Bye Bye Birdie, and it was like, this was 1963, so it was pre-Beatles, and it was really, nobody acts like that. Girls don't do that. They don't
Yeah.
scream and faint. And then, of course, the Beatles came. It was like, oh, okay, that's how it is. And then we found out later that they did that for Sinatra and for Elvis.
Sure.
So it wasn't like an actual fantasy. And when I went to high school, I was an artist growing up. I drew compulsively. I'd be drawing in class, and the teacher would call on me. And I was like, what? Wait a second. What's 14 times? Yeah, I don't know. So I was basically drawing comic book characters, the Fantastic Four and Captain America and stuff like that. Jack Kirby was my idol. The guy who created all the Marvel characters that Stan Lee took credit for.
Sure.
But then when I got to high school, I realized I could sing, and I went to some auditions, and I started singing in like garage bands and stuff like that. And then I basically tried to be a rock star over the years. Had some interesting encounters with some people. I don't know if you know about a book that not Voodoo Macbeth, but a book that was published about this girl that I knew that became famous.
Oh, that's right. I came across that was it. Was it Blondie? Was that who?
No, it wasn't Debbie Harry. It was Madonna.
Madonna. That's right.
If you're interested in any of that stuff, there's some interesting stories in it. It's a book called My Madonna. You would have to order it through Amazon. I don't know if anyone would be interested in that, but and just in case anyone is interested in some other stuff.
Absolutely. What I mean, we'll go back to high school years in a little bit, but this kind of carries beyond high school, it sounds like. But what kinds of, you were in garage bands, what kinds of music were you playing over the years? Because it sounds like you were involved in it for quite some time. And were you touring at all? Did you do any local shows? What kinds of activity do you have in your musical career? It's a very interesting aspect.
So when I got to high school, basically it was the second wave of British invasion, which was
Okay.
and like blues based bands like
Cream.
Cream,
Yeah.
Jimi Hendrix, the Paul Butterfield Blues Band,
Sure.
Led Zeppelin. Jeff Beck was my favorite guitar player.
Sure.
Led Zeppelin. So it was mostly cover bands, just doing the latest knockoffs of the latest blues based. But then we got much more serious into. I started playing a bit of guitar, and it was like, you got really serious about who the real guys were. B.B. King and. But I would say in terms of my guitar style, I would say it would be between like Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton.
Okay.
But it was basically blues based and singing. I was a big Doors fan. I love Jim Morrison.
Sure.
But it's like all through my teens and 20s, I was in one band after another, and we did original material. We wrote a couple of songs, we did covers. And come around as I started to approach 30, I'm like, well, I'm getting a little old for this. This is nothing really as much happening. I'm going to just kind of put this aside.
Sure.
And then it was like 35. This is 1986. I met, it's interesting that the whole Haitian thing has always popped up in my life. I was working at a t-shirt design studio, airbrushing shirts, and I hired a black Haitian kid named Richie, and he had two sisters, and they had their own band. And they said, well, you know anything about house music? I don't know anything about house music. So we started recording these house tracks, and they got picked up by DJs. If you go online and look, if you Google Craze at the World 1988, you'll see basically what I was doing. And we ended up going touring this record. It went to #2 all over Europe. So
Wow.
I'd always wanted to be a rock star. I gave up on music, and then I just felt like accidentally I ended up doing, going around the world with a band, but it wasn't really my music. It
Sure.
was just kind of like, well, you got your dream, but it's not quite what you really wanted. Here's like a taste of it. And in a sense, I'm glad it worked out that way, because the older I got and the more I saw, I realized that world is not a healthy place for most humans.
That's right. That's right. The hours, drugs, other substances,
And
all of that.
the more famous you are, the more you're beholden to some entity that will tell you what to do and what to say.
Yep.
Yeah. It's
Wow.
like, okay, we'll give you a #1 record. You can become one of the gods, but you have to sell your soul to the devil first. So
Yep.
here's a pen.
That's right. That's right. Wow. That's a pretty remarkable story from playing in garage bands to touring around the world with a house band, or I guess, yeah.
But in my late 20s, I was always hanging around with musicians and artists and dancers. Also, I had a lot of friends who were dancers, and I went to a party one night, and I met Madonna, who had just come to New York. She'd been in town for like 6 or 8 months, and she was a struggling dancer. And I ended up introducing her to a friend of mine that basically started her first band. And all the connections she made through me and through him pretty much ended up getting her signed.
Wow.
So, there are 2 people I knew before they were famous, and I look at them today and go, who is that person? One of them was a kid I went to high school with, whose name was Stanley Eisen. He started a band with his friends in Queens called Kiss.
Oh,
So
sure.
he's
Sure.
Paul Stanley.
Ah, that's right.
So I used to work with him on 42nd Street. We would be a newspaper route. We would carry the papers down to the station. We would talk about the girls we spent time with, and we
Sure,
talk about music.
sure.
And so he became mega, and then there was Madonna, who was this hungry, starving waif, little angelic waif, who's, if you look at her, the music she's doing now at like close in her 60s, with like this weird satanic stuff going on in the background. It's like, what the fuck? What is happening to this world?
Wow, wow.
So I'm so glad. I mean, I'm 70 years old now. I'll be 71 in next month, and I'm so glad that that did not happen to me. Even though I don't know where I barely know where my next whatever is coming from, and don't know where my life is going. But I've got a 19-year-old son and a wife, and my life is fairly normal.
Sure, sure. Wow. And even though you've moved on from the music world, you definitely have kept up with drawing over the years, as your graphic novel, of course, illustrates. Are there other outlets that you have for your visual art that you've developed over the years as well?
For years I would draw in a comic book style. Even when I was a kid, before I discovered comic books, I would be drawing like Treasure Island, but all my drawings had a story behind them.
Sure,
It was
sure.
always like an illustration. It wasn't like a random thing. So I always drew in sequential art form, but and I would do paintings and stuff like that as well. But I would start these stories and never be able to finish them. I would have this great idea, I'm going to do this character and blah, blah, blah. I would start the story and then I would run out of steam. But when Tim Robbins he did a movie on The Cradle Will Rock in around 1999-ish, it came out. And Orson Welles was involved. And I'm not sure if my father was in that cast. But I said, wow, I gotta do my version of this story. And
Yeah,
I didn't know what it was going to be about. I just knew it was going to be about the play and my father was going to be involved, but I thought it was going to be about my father. And I just started drawing and I started writing and I started conceptualizing. And this was between 2000 and it took me about a year to do.
yeah.
And at a certain point, it's like the story took over. Like the story was telling me what I had to say. So it ended up being more about Jack Carter and about Macbeth, the character that played Macbeth. But my father ended up being just a peripheral character.
Sure.
But again, he was Hecate. The Orson changed the Queen of the Witches, Hecate, into a male voodoo priest.
Yeah,
So he's kind of like the instigator. So the whole graphic novel ended up being about the Faust myth, about selling your soul.
sure,
And
sure.
and this Christian guy reviewed my book, my graphic novel, online. I'll send you a link to it at some point, and I've got to send you the graphic novel as well. But I read it and it blew my mind. It's like, oh, that's what it was about. Okay, I get it now. Because when I first finished it, I sent it to this publisher in England. I was actually in England at the time. This was like going on 20 years ago. And he said, I really like this. I want to publish it, but I don't like the ending. The ending it goes nowhere. So I said, okay, let me think about this. So I dug in a little bit more, and this was like 3 or 4 years after I'd finished it, and I basically thought it was finished. And I realized that after 2 or 3 years after Voodoo Macbeth, the actor that played Macbeth, Jack Carter, did a production of Faust with Orson Welles. And I said, oh, okay, that's the ending. They're back on this Faustian thing.
Yeah.
And they've gone full circle. It's like they started with this, then it ends, and the main tagline in the book is my father's last line in the play. If you look for the WPA film of Voodoo Macbeth, the ending of the film is my father leaping up and saying the charm's wound up. So it was like the spell.
Wow.
And the spell winds up, but it keeps going around. So
Yeah.
that was essentially the end. And it was the Faust thing. It was, yeah.
Wow.
I'll send you a copy of the graphic novel at some point. I just have to get to a post office, but
Sure.
I'm
Sure.
in the
Yeah.
middle of kind of nowhere here.
Okay. Okay.
This
Well,
is the north of England. It's very quiet.
oh, I see. I see. Well, looking forward to it whenever you do get a chance. Um, what what was it like for you? Even though your father ended up playing a more peripheral role than you might have imagined at first, but what was it like for you creating something, at least somehow revolving around your father? Did you feel more connected to him, or what was that process like?
Yeah. I mean, I always respected what he did. Hang on for 1 second.
Yeah, sure, sure.
I always respected what he did, but I never really spent a lot of time thinking about it. But when I decided to delve into it, I got a whole bunch of Wells biographies, and I remembered the stories he told, and I tried to tie everything together. And yeah, it just all made sense at a
Yeah,
certain point. That
yeah,
the magnitude of the whole thing, and the fact that it really never, it was a very, it was a fragment in time. It kind of got passed by.
that's right.
Very few people remember it, but it was a pivotal moment in Wells' career, because he was able to, that's when he got noticed pretty much by the bigwigs, and they offered him a movie, and he started out doing Heart of Darkness.
Yeah,
He spent months and months on doing a treatment of Heart of Darkness, and then he realized it wasn't working, and he went with Citizen Kane.
yep.
But essentially, Citizen Kane is some kind of version of Heart of Darkness. It's kind of like the journey into a man's psyche, and what makes him who he is, Rosebud.
That's right.
We all have our rosebuds, the loss of innocence or whatever. But yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about your father's career in light of the whole Faustian thing, because he evidently never sold his soul in that way, and even developed eventually stage fright and things like
Yeah.
that.
The only other role I saw him on stage with Eartha Kitt, and I must have
Hmm.
been again 7 or 8 years old, and
Yeah.
it was a called Mrs. Patterson,
Huh.
and he played Mr. D.
Okay.
Again, he was playing the devil.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Huh.
I think that role did a number on his head. I'm not quite sure what happened, but
Yeah.
um, yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I didn't ever speak to him. I wish, when I started working on this thing, I was like, God, I wish I had asked him more about all of this, because I've got to make a lot of this stuff up.
Sure.
But then the whole story, as I said, the whole story ended up not being that much about him, that he was sort of like more like a symbolic
Yeah.
character.
Yeah.
but there were all these characters in the film that were like, you know, who is being seduced and who is doing the seducing, who is trying to manipulate who, and because there's like a mafia don and there's all this stuff going on in the plot.
Yeah.
I'll send you a link to this review because I really feel like this guy nailed it.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that. Yeah. Um, so I just want to check on your time here before I ask any more questions. How are you doing time-wise?
Well, how much more do you think you need?
Well, I would say, we still need to dive a little more into high school. Um, a little bit of things post high school, post or a little bit about moving away from the coops and all of that. So, um, maybe 30 more minutes or so, I
Yeah,
imagine.
I'll say I'll commit to 20 and see
Okay.
how I feel.
Okay, that sounds good. So before we dive a little more into high school, just another general Coops question. Um, are there like other families in the Coops that your family was particularly close with, aside from friends you had in the Coops, but any other names of other people in the Coops that you want to mention as, having a close relationship with while you were growing up?
Um, well, Judy Winston was as I said, a good friend of my sister's, and I feel like she was a big, somewhat of an influence on me. Uh, did anyone speak of Sharon Taylor and Melissa Taylor?
Yes, and
They
I
were good. They were good friends of Corollas, but they also became, especially in the last, like, in my 30s and 40s, I was pretty close with Sharon in particular.
sure.
I was in school with Sharon, and yeah, Sharon Taylor. I was pretty good friends with Jo Ellen
Sure.
in the early 70s. When she was living with a gal named Raquel Vargas. I don't know if her name ever came up
She mentioned Raquel before.
yeah. So I went to junior high school with Raquel, and um, where was I? Sharon. There was a girl, two twins named Karen and Claudia Brown,
Huh.
who were Corolla's friends, but I dated Claudia around 1971 for about 6 or 8 months.
Yeah.
Um, I was very good friends with Saul Weintraub.
Okay, sure. I've
I
come
don't know
across
if you
that
know
name
who he
before.
is.
I never met him or talked to him, but I've come across the name before. Yeah.
Ira Polanski was my best friend for a while,
Okay,
as
sure.
far as Kupnik. Also, Eric Block, Ricky
Hmm.
Block.
Never come across his name
Yeah,
now.
yeah. I would say those were my best friends in the Coops. Kid named Salo Herman, but I was never really close to him.
Yeah.
Um, as I said, a lot of my friends were from the projects.
Sure.
There was a kid named I'm drawing a blank. Yeah, well, Steve Brower was probably my best friend. Scott Blagman lived on Allerton Avenue.
Okay. Yeah.
A good friend of mine. His father was a songwriter, wrote a lot of the songs for the Mad Magazine record album.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah. Bobby Siligato, who became a cop. Did that
Okay.
name ever come up?
No, no. Is he from the Coops?
Well, no, he was from the projects.
He's from the projects. Okay.
And there were a bunch of kids from Leidig Avenue from that area that I was
Sure.
friendly with. became more friendly with later in the 70s, Robert Elber. Let me think. One of the kids that was in the executioners became a friend of mine for a little while. His name was Bobby Fruchthandler.
Okay. That's a long.
The other kid who was in the executioners was Donnie Budway. There was a kid who was like a notorious bad kid whose name might have come up, was, had a really bad reputation. His name was Johnny Bromo.
Oh, I think someone mentioned
John
him
Francis
before.
Brummer.
Okay, yeah.
Anyone mention him?
Yeah, I think someone mentioned
I
him.
think he was
Maybe
like
Llewellyn,
he
but
was found hung to death or some crazy shit like that. I don't
wow.
know. So a lot of those kids became junkies. Several people went to Vietnam. I know that Donald Cody went to Vietnam, got messed up, but came back okay. He became a postman. His brother Kevin was a bit twisted, and I think he was beaten to death with a baseball bat or something horrible like that.
Wow.
A lot of stuff happened in the 70s that I wasn't that aware of because I didn't spend much time in the neighborhood.
Sure.
But that's when there was probably more like weird racial stuff or just strange drug related stuff. Cause, first there was acid, then there was speed, then there was, heroin.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember smoking weed for the first time in like 1967, and or 66, and I hadn't even taken a drink yet. I didn't really drink alcohol till I was 18.
Sure.
I smoked probably more weed, but not that much. But yeah, the drugs started to get heavy and strange in the 70s, and the whole neighborhood, it was funny because people were moving out of the Coops and moving to Co-op City.
Yeah.
And they said, when the neighborhood started to get more integrated, I would hear things, even when I was a kid, like, eventually they're going to screw up the neighborhood's going to go bad and for whatever reason, the neighborhood really, I went back there last summer for a little while, and it just looked like a third world country to me, which, it's like a loss of innocence. I understand, people have to have, everyone deserves a good life, and everyone should be happy and live and let live. But it's kind of sad to see a neighborhood that seemed like it was really, really stable. And there's so many reasons for all of this, but as a child, you want the things that were pure and innocent to you to stay, to have that sense of stability. But I guess kind of we're all going through a disillusionment with the world right now. There's something going on in the fabric of the world that doesn't feel like it used to.
How long did you live in the neighborhood? What year was it that you finally moved out?
I found an apartment on St. Mark's Place, of all places, in 1974.
Okay, I see.
So I was pretty much gone. I would go back and visit my mom and dad, and I probably hung out there with some friends up until about 75 or 76. But by then, almost all my friends were gone.
Yeah. And what about your
there's one
friends?
kid I knew back then. I went to PS 96 with, and I think he's still there. His name is Tom DeLuca.
Oh, Tom DeLuca. Huh.
Yeah, I think he's still in the Bronx, and I don't even know if he's still in the same building or something.
Interesting.
But
I wonder if
talk
he
about
got
white flight.
Yeah.
Because I remember my friend Steve Brower ended up moving to Co-op City.
Okay,
A
sure.
lot of my friends from the Coops or from the projects moved to Co-op City.
Yep. Yep. I know that. I know that. What about your parents? How long did they live in the coops?
They until they died. My father died and he was 81. He died in 1982,
Okay.
and my mom died at 86 in 19. She died 1 month before 9/11. She died on August 11th,
Oh, wow.
2001.
Okay, so
Yeah,
she got,
that was another thing that made me want to get the hell out of New York, because I moved to California the next year.
I
It
see.
felt like, because my mom had just died, and then this thing happened, and it's like,
Yeah,
disillusionment.
sure,
New
sure.
York had always been like, it's a crazy place, anything can happen any second. But I felt like I knew the rules. I mean, I could go anywhere and feel like I was street smart.
Yeah,
But it's like, also when you're in New York, there's a movie, a book actually. It's the Maltese Falcon, and Sam Spade tells a story about a guy named Flitcraft who's walking down the street and a paving stone falls and almost hits him, and he realizes that life is completely random and anything can happen at any time.
yeah,
That's kind of how I felt on 9/11. It's like, well, how many paving stones you're
yep.
going to be able to dodge when you're like 80. So yeah, I
Wow,
still love New York. I go back there as often as I can, but
sure.
it feels a bit more intense than it used to.
Hmm.
Maybe that's just me being old.
Um, so why don't you talk a little bit more? I mean, it's kind of woven through a lot already about your experience in high school and what high school was like for you. You know, a kid from the Bronx now going back into Manhattan on a daily basis, and what the whole experience was like.
Oh, well, it was like the movie Fame. It was like all these crazy artistic kids acting out, bouncing off the walls. It was great. I loved it. And I was a good looking kid. I was a good artist. I was a good musician. Yeah, I came out of my shell because I'd always been very introverted.
Sure.
So I became like charismatic, and, you know, I think high school was one of the high points in my life. And I've almost nothing but fond memories
Sure.
about, um, about high school.
What
I'd
year did
say
you?
I have mostly fond memories about almost all of my life.
Sure. Sure. What year did you graduate high school? Was that
1970.
1970? So what was going on at, the local high school level as far as, the various social movements, social upheavals that were going on across the US? Um,
Well, there were a couple of kids in the school that were, doing the Black Power thing. The president of the school was a Black kid named Donald Reed, called Memoirs of a Processed Brother, or
okay.
something like that. You can actually probably find his book somewhere. But it's funny, my dad came to my graduation, in the middle of graduation, and my dad would when he would go out in the street shopping, he'd put a suit and tie on. Like,
Yeah.
he dressed, he was all my family on my father's side were very much into education, they were basically Europeanized. They had this sense of themselves as, well educated, well heeled people. And um in the middle of the graduation ceremony, these three Black kids came up on stage with the Black Power flag, and they interrupted the ceremony. And it's like, I will now salute the revolutionary blah 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 blah. And the principal was like, please, everyone, please ignore these, disruptive influence. My father was totally appalled, and he was down with the civil rights movement, and he was sympathetic to everything. but he just thought this was a complete affront. It's like,
Yeah.
these kids have no business doing this. So, but that, there wasn't that much. We were next to City College, so there was probably a
Sure.
lot of stuff going on the campus there.
Sure.
And so we were aware of it. I remember the date because Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King were killed within several months of each other. It was Martin Luther King was April 4th. Bobby Kennedy was June 6th. And I remember when Bobby Kennedy was shot, we all walked out of school and went down to Central Park. And actually, that's where I met my first girlfriend. I was 15 going on 16. And
Oh, wow.
that was, even though that was a horrible, traumatic day, that meeting this girl and, falling in love. Because I'd gone out with other girls, but this was my first like serious relationship.
Sure.
So that was kind of traumatic and blissful at the same time.
Of course.
But yeah, I don't remember the Martin Luther King assassination as well, but definitely I remember the day that JFK was assassinated. I was in school and people started talking and it was like the teacher said, it's nothing happened. Just, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And then when we left school, it was like, oh my God, this happened. And this one kid said, it's a rumor. It's a rumor. And I said to myself, well, it's a rumor, but is it a true rumor? I also remember the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, sure.
I was scared out of
Yeah.
my wits. I was like 10 or 11 years old, 10 going on 11. And I was looking up in the sky and seeing planes and thinking they were about to drop a bomb. I was just totally freaked.
Of course.
And I went to my father and I said, Dad, do you think there's going to be a war? And he said, yes. That's not something that your father could do. So that was the one day I think I was traumatized more than any other was Cuban Missile Crisis.
Wow. And
back to high school. Sorry,
no. This is exactly how oral histories usually go, because memories are not
They're
chronological. Exactly. So in high school, did you have any kind of ideas? Well, I guess maybe your idea was to become a rock star, but I was going to ask if you had any ideas as far as where your life might take you next and how those ideas, changed after high school.
I had this mistaken belief that the world was going to open up for me, and because I was really popular for a while, and I felt like, I had something going on. But when I got out of high school, I realized that I was just another schleb in the streets, and I had to work to make my way. And I started going to clubs downtown. I went to a club called Max's Kansas City, which was kind of like one of the first places where punk music got started. And then I got a job when I was 22 doing hand-painted T-shirts. And that was my first job. And that's how I was able to move out of my parents' house. Because by that time I was desperate to get out of the Bronx, to get out of my parents' house. And so I realized that life was not going to be that easy. And I really didn't like working. I probably didn't get a job. I had a job with the New York Post when I was in high school, and I was also doing some nude modeling at the Art Students League. Just anything that was easy.
Sure.
It wasn't too stressful, but just I'd gotten a couple of jobs and just quit after 2 weeks, like cleaning carpets. It's just like I can't do this shit. It's like slave labor.
Yeah.
So I got this one job I got was actually perfect for me at the time, because I could sit and draw for hours. It was like a God-given opportunity, and that basically got me on some kind of track where I could, be in a socialized workplace and actually enjoy myself.
Sure. Sure. So reflecting back on your, time growing up in the Coops, your, I guess, early adulthood in the Coops, are there ways that growing up in the Coops that you recognize now, like, shaped your life going forward? And how did it shape your life, if it did?
Well, I mean, there were a couple of aspects. There was the socioeconomic aspect, where it was a fairly sane, egalitarian, stable place, but also it was the late 50s, early 60s. So it was kind of like on the forefront of all these movements, beatniks, hippies, human potential.
Yeah.
A lot of these ideas that were coming from the intelligentsia were kind of out in the streets right away. There was also the physical aspect of being in this, Tudor architectural area surrounded by trees with a really nice playground on one side and a park on the other side. And so, it was as far as places growing up, it was pretty special. I can't, I mean, I things certainly could have been better. I could have been, I don't know what, but they also certainly could have been much worse if I'd say grown up in Spanish Harlem.
Sure.
Although I don't know, what would have happened then. But just the space and the light and the fresh air and, fairly nice people, diversity. Diversity is a concept that it doesn't work very well in places that are insular. I mean, you can't suddenly take like a small town Christian atmosphere and all of a sudden start introducing these disparate elements and, disruptive. You can't expect people to adjust to that. But where we grew up was actually, at least for its time, the best example of diversity that one could imagine.
Yeah.
That was part of the zeitgeist, essentially. And New York is like that for the most part. But, being in the ghetto with diversity, as opposed to being on Park Avenue with some sense of diversity, as opposed to being in, whatever, Riverdale or someplace like that, exclusive. And we were all pretty much equalized by a certain degree of socioeconomic stability.
Sure.
I don't know, something like that.
Sure. This is something that I didn't ask you earlier. Which court and apartment number was your family's apartment in?
The first court, S51. If you look on my YouTube page, there's a shot of my building, I think.
Sure.
I just took the shot last year.
Okay. Yeah.
So it still looks the same. At least that section of the coop still looks the same. The playground doesn't look the same anymore.
Yeah, it's been renovated.
But the park and the coops themselves still look really nice.
Yeah, that's right. And another kind of minor question about the physical space as well. Was the auditorium or the library or anything like that in use while you were growing up, or had that all more or less faded away at that point?
Well, as I said, we went to this. Went to this show for probably over the course of about a year. So there was a classroom that we were in, and then they held like a bazaar a couple of times a year. And for the holidays, they had sort of little get-togethers. I don't remember the library, but I do remember a couple of large rooms that, they had these little parties at where they served latkes, which I still to this day love. And Humantaschen. It's funny because in the last couple of years, I'm kind of leaning towards being a Christian. I was basically raised an atheist, didn't believe in any form of God, but then I started meditating in my early 20s, and I started feeling a sense of there being some sort of a higher power. But then I realized that this Yiddish show gave me a foundation in Old Testament, these Bible stories.
Sure.
And I think I think part of the stability of that area and of the world in general then, as opposed to now, is that there was still kind of a fundamental rooting in a Judeo-Christian ethic. People believed in these ideas much more than they do now. Now, I'd say a lot of people out there, call themselves atheists or secular humanists or whatever.
Sure.
But I think, again, there was something about the stability of that place, and there was a St. Lucy's church. There was a bunch of little churches in the area. There were synagogues. A bunch of my friends went to Catholic school. Yeah, there was much more of a sense of that back then.
Sure. So I'm sure there's more, I'm sure there's a lot more aspects of your life that we could get into, but I want to respect your time. So I think for now I'll ask one final question of you, and then as I'm sure probably more will occur to you or more will occur to me, we can always do follow-ups. The final question I have for you, it's a very broad question, and I'm sure it's changed over time, but what does the Bronx represent to you?
That's a difficult question. I mean, it represents innocence and stability, at least the way it was back then. Because growing up, I had friends from all over, Brooklyn and Queens.
Sure.
And I didn't know too many people in Brooklyn. Brooklyn seemed more like an outland, a bit more threatening.
Sure.
Queens, once I got to know it, seemed similar to the Bronx.
Yeah.
And Manhattan was, of course, the great city of Oz that had all the wonders and the great things and the scary things, and Times Square and all the weird stuff that. But the Bronx was sort of like a place apart from a simpler place. I was just thinking about the other day, when you're a kid and wherever you are is the center of the universe, and then you go someplace 1,000 miles away, like where I am now, and it's like there's a million little towns with people who that's the center of their universe. And I think what I like about where I am now is that it has a similar quiet sense of stability to when I was growing up. I don't feel like that piece of pavement is going to fall off the building and hit me in the head. Of course, that could happen anywhere, obviously.
Sure.
But yeah, your youth, hopefully, if you're lucky, your youth should be a place where you can feel comfortable and grow up with a sense of stability, that you can believe the world is a rational place. And even if the world becomes irrational, like it's starting to feel more and more irrational, you still have that sense inside that it's possible, that there are good people and that they're everywhere, and it is possible to have a sane and stable life. Also if you keep that strong moral center, that foundational sense of who you are and what the world is, then it becomes easier to deal with adversity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that's a really rich answer to the question, and Norris, I really appreciate you sharing all of your memories and reflections in this oral history. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.